This week's film is The Last Black Man in San Francisco, directed by Joe Talbot in 2019, co-written and based on a play by Talbot and Jimmy Fails. Jimmy plays himself, or a version of himself, in this film. It was a film that was funded using a Kickstarter campaign, which began in 2014. Took roughly 3 years to raise enough cash to get the production going. And I suppose, if that's the measure, then this may be the most independent of all the independent films that we've seen this semester. Danny Glover was actually cast for the film because he saw the Kickstarter campaign and called Fails up directly and said, "Hey, I want to be in your movie." So it's based on a play that was co-written by Talbot and Fails, which is, as I said, based loosely on the life of Fails, who plays Jimmy in the film. Um, but it's also a movie about the life of a city, specifically San Francisco, in a period of transition. We're going to talk about gentrification a couple slides down, but just sort of give you a sense of the city that we're talking about here, even more specifically the Fillmore District, which was historically one of the most diverse in the city and coincidentally the center of West Coast jazz, community that has lost its identity over the past decade or so as a result of basically the explosion of Silicon Valley, which is what takes over San Francisco. It's the Google folks, et cetera, who are moving in and buying up all the houses and driving up real estate prices. There's another way of sort of thinking about this story, however, is what kind of life story is it telling, basically. And I want to use as a kind of metaphorical point of reference the difference between a memoir and a biography or an autobiography. An autobiography or biography is constructed around the sort of key moments in the life of whatever the character is that's being described in the narrative. So this happened, then this happened, then this happened. You're kind of building the bullet points of a life, as opposed to a memoir, which is more about the impressions, the memories, the anecdotes, etc., of a subject, right? That they sort of understand the relationship in a much more subjective and fragmented way. Last Black Man is a story that certainly hews more to that sort of notion of a memoir. It is about impressions, it's about senses, it's about feelings, etc. The first discussion question: what stands out most to you about San Francisco as portrayed in this film, and why? So one of the main themes of this film is home and notions of home, specifically home as a house and home as the city that you live in. In the press junket for this film, when Jimmy Fails was going around doing press for it, he said he would describe the film as a love story between me and a house, which is an odd sort of way of thinking about love, since obviously a house is an inanimate object, but it's a profound one in several ways. And obviously, it's also, if not the central relationship in the story, a key one. What is it about this place? And we'll talk about that in a second. But it's also a story about one's love for a city, and even more importantly, I think, one's right to love a city. Jimmy's riding on the Muni, the kind of subway or the metro system, and he's listening to these young people complain who've just recently moved into San Francisco, complaining about what it lacks and how they hate it here. And he says, you can't hate something if you didn't love it first. And that relationship, of course, is really important, right? What right do you have to disparage something if you don't really know it, if it isn't yours? Which is tied to a conceit at the center of this movie. Jimmy's telling a false narrative, right, about the house that supposedly he's in this love relationship with, but also an unrequited love story here. And I mean that, and these two things sort of diverge slightly. One is about the love that doesn't love you back, right, which is what unrequited love is. And then the other is about what you love versus what you own. In other words, these notions of belonging or possession, right? We often think of love as an act of possession. You belong to me, that sort of a thing. But what does it mean to own something? So the next discussion question is, why do you think the house holds so much importance to Jimmy? Why does he give it so much value in the story? Well, take a wider view of things here for a second and describe what I would refer to as the sociological frame. And there are three main sort of big picture themes that run through this story. One, of course, is gentrification, but more specifically, how that's related to race and implicitly to class. You see that right in the title of the film, The Last Black Man in San Francisco. Specifically, the neighborhood that the story is set in, which is the neighborhood that the real Jimmy Fails did grow up in, Fillmore District, which had a population that had previously been a majority non-white, and more specifically Japanese American, Jewish American, and African American, but had been gentrified, as we'll see, and redeveloped starting in the 1970s. The African American population specifically exploded around World War II, and there were three reasons for that. Number one, there were a lot of jobs in San Francisco. It's a port town, and it was a shipbuilding. There was a lot of shipbuilding industry around. So obviously, the war machine required a lot of labor. Second was the internment of the Japanese during the Second World War, which cleared out a lot of the residents for several years, and houses were left empty and immediately bought up, somewhat scandalously, but nonetheless, that's what happens. And finally, the migration of a lot of black folk from the South in the Jim Crow period that followed, not followed, but intensified after and during the Second World War. Moving west and moving north, which is essentially what leads you to San Francisco. So there's a huge settlement of African Americans in the middle of the 20th century, but by the 1970s, as a result of a massive redistricting effort in San Francisco, they were driven out, basically. Not just African Americans, but all sorts of folks who would have claimed this neighborhood as their own. It was described by the local black folks who had lived there and been driven out by the rising housing and rental prices as a quote unquote Negro removal. And it's very specific phrasing here, because often redevelopment is, and gentrification is, if not explicitly, at least implicitly, about quote unquote de-ghettoization, right? Uh, Quote unquote cleaning up neighborhoods, that sort of a thing. And there's always a racial component to that, whether it's intended or unintended. In the case of the redevelopment of the Fillmore district, there's pretty heavy evidence that it was intended, right, to whiteify the neighborhood, basically, which is often the indirect result of gentrification, since wealth often takes the face of you know a white population coming in. The second theme is toxic masculinity. And we see this in one of the kind of major subplots of the story, um, when describing this group of young black men who kind of, are living in the neighborhood and are always sort of standing on the street corner and commenting about this and that. Fales and Talbot would refer to them as the Greek chorus, right? That they're sort of there to comment on what's going on all the time. But within their grouping, and certainly as they relate to Jimmy and his friend Mont, who we'll get to in a second, there's a huge amount of toxicity in the relationship. And the film asks the question, why is that? Why do young black men relate to each other in a particular way? What are the forces behind that, etc.? And of course, it's a masculinity that's not only toxic, but has tragic consequences in at least one case. And finally, and related obviously, is black male friendship, and specifically the relationship between Jimmy and Mont, which is a profound and beautiful and loving one. Almost a, I don't, I mean, it is a contrast, but it's almost an alternative to a certain extent of the more toxic relationships that we witness in the neighborhood. This is a relationship that is largely based on Jimmy and Joe Talbot, the director's relationship to each other. So it is partly biographical, but it's also there to emphasize a kind of, I guess, other path, for lack of a better phrase. So the discussion question is, what strikes you most about the tone of the social commentary in this film, and why? Finally, I want to talk about Mont's play, and not necessarily offer an analysis of it, but ask you to sort of ask yourself some questions about what's going on here. First of all, what is the play about? And by about, I mean not only what is the narrative of it, but what is it intended to do? What is Mont's purpose in it? He's been working on this for a long time. He eventually mounts a production of it, and there's clearly intention in it, right? He's trying to do something with it. So, what is that exactly? Second is to consider the performance space, which is in this old Victorian house that Jimmy claims is his kind of ancestral home that his grandfather supposedly built. It takes place in an upper room. There's a very specific kind of theatrical dynamic to this space. Why do you think it takes place there, and how does it impact the performance? The audience is very important here. Who are the people that have been gathered in to listen, to you know, collaborate, really, because that is what ends up happening as the play kind of, I don't want to say unspools. To a certain extent, it seems intentional. Mont is calling people to respond, largely. So, who are these folks? Why are they there? And what do they contribute? And finally, the upshot of the play, which is the closing. And I don't want to sort of get into a million details about this, but the ways in which it impacts Mont and Jimmy's relationship. And I'm thinking particularly of that scene down by the water, where they're, with the rowboat, and they're sort of forced to kind of look at each other, maybe not in a different way, but a more honest way. And it's a result of Mont's play. Very specifically, that's the catalyst of it. So the last discussion question is, why do you think Talbot chooses Mont's play as a vehicle for revealing underlying truths in this film?